Patrick DeWitt was born on Vancouver Island in 1975. He's the author of the critically acclaimed novel Ablutions, which was named a New York Times Editor's Choice book. He lives in Portland, Oregon with his wife and son. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
The Canada Council, and going from the depths to the heights. You got a grant from them when things were looking...
Yeah, things were grim. I was writing full time, and I had been for about 2 years, and I was well into an early draft of the Sisters Brothers when money started to run out, and I had applied for a grant, I guess about 6 months before, and the results were due sort of momentarily. But I was looking around for work. Before I was writing, I was doing construction with my father, so I was calling him and asking if there was any openings or if he had any jobs and things like that. And it was sort of a rotten thing to think of going back to the grind of that, especially if you're doing something physical like construction. There's no time at all. You know, it's early days, and then also you're very tired physically and mentally when you come home, so it's not as though you can work when you clock out, you know. So I was basically looking at writing on the weekends, and that's just imperfect, you know.
So we're at a point where you're facing doing something you prefer not to do.
Yeah, but the most frustrating part of it was when I work construction with my father, it's usually my father, my uncle, and my little brother, and we have fun on the job, but it's still, I feel like I'm doing something that I'd much rather be writing. I'm a much better writer than construction worker. Hated the idea of having to stop working because things were going really well, and
you were in the flow of it. And
yeah, I was just very much involved with it, and it was something that was sort of on my mind all day long, every day, and feeling exactly how you want to feel when you're working on a big project. And so I was a bit heartbroken that I was going to have to stop. And yeah, then at sort of the 11th hour, the word came through that I'd gotten the grant, and that I wouldn't have to be going back to doing construction, and it was just a really great moment for me.
It was right on the edge, and now here we are, and you've won the Governor General's Award.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not as if they've said, okay, we've given you this grant and now we're going to give you this award. Quite the opposite. There's an independent jury to judge your work in their view to be the best of the finalists.
Yeah, it was a real surprise for me, but a great honor as well.
Let's get into the language of the book. I was struck by the similarity to a movie I'd recently seen called True Grit, and the way that the Coen Brothers exploited the comic possibilities of an artificially ornate style. And I was reminded actually of a scene in Raising Arizona where Tom Waits is asked what he does for a living, and he says, murder, etc.
True Grit, the source material for the film is a book of the same name by Charles Portis, and I've been reading Charles Portis since I was 15 or something like that, so yeah, I'm a big fan of Portis's work, his other books especially. True Grit is, sort of a perfect book, but then I think everything that Charles Portis has done has been really kind of peerless. I remember reading a book of his called Dog of the South when I was 15 or 16, and it elevated comedic writing for me. Before then I considered comedic writing, I guess, lesser than dramatic writing. And Charles Portis is one of those very rare people who can, it's funny and you're laughing really hard, but it's also very, very serious. The way he uses words and his economy of phrases, very smart man. I consider Charles Portis sort of an ongoing influence. I think it's very clear in this book, but even in my first book, which has nothing to do thematically or stylistically with this one, I can see bits of Portis in there as well. He's just one of those people that's at the very top of my list of people that I admire.
The language is polite and formal and grammatical, and there's an elaborate diction to it. It contradicts this lowlife, if you will, this uncivilized state of nature that these assassins are crawling around in.
Probably not realistic that these men would have spoken like this, and that's okay with me. It doesn't bother me if things are historically incorrect, and it was never my goal to make a historical document. Early on, I experimented with the language quite a lot, and I had some of the men speaking in a way that maybe would be more familiar to us in terms of the Western genre, and people sounding much less intelligent and much less poetic and much less thoughtful.
Sounding like a typical Western movie cowboy.
Yeah, and I really had a revulsion to that when I was writing. I would try to write it out, and men saying ain't and things like that. It just didn't feel good, to write it, and I didn't want any of these men to sound that way, and I just didn't feel comfortable doing it somehow. I just had a sort of real visceral reaction to it, so I scrapped it and decided that no one in this book would speak like that. Even the people that are clearly very down on their luck and really gritty characters, they're all very introspective, and they're all say these really highly intelligent, poetic things at the drop of a hat. Again, it's probably not realistic, but it was much more interesting for me to write that voice than the more realistic voice.
Well, and it's just funny. I mean, I can't help but smiling just talking about it.
Yeah, that's the thing about writing the more realistic, and ignorant tone of voice. It's just not fun for me. And if you're not having fun, then why bother?
Why bother anything? Early on, the two brothers are tasked by the Commodore to assassinate Herman Kermit Warm. I couldn't help but think of a Herman Hermits.
The name Herman Warm, actually, I just stole it. I was watching a silent movie from the 30s, a German silent movie. I believe the cinematographer was named Herman Warm. And there's something about film credits. The older the movie, the more I pay attention. But names are hard to come by, and I'm always sort of on the scout for good names. You oftentimes will see just really very odd names. That was one that I actually thought was so great. I wrote it down. So between that name, and I added the Kermit just to give it an extra beat, but between the name and that book about the gold rush that I bought at a yard sale, there was one picture I cut out. It was like an old daguerreotype of a miner, and he was this very sort of wild-looking man with a big beard, and he had this really dramatic sash tied around his waist, and he looked very proud, but he also looked a little disturbed. And so I thought, well, who's this man? I had his picture pegged above my computer on the wall, and then around that time I had watched this German expressionist silent film, and so I just put the two together. So I can't really take credit for Herman Warm. I think it's just such a great name.
Well, it's so great what you've done with Kermit too. I mean, I can't help but think of the frog, and there's that humor, and with a very serious-sounding name, just like you've done with the language in a way.
Yeah, it's just keeping a straight face. It's just one of those things. It's my role in this book is really just to be a straight man.
That's interesting because Jane Smiley, in a review in The Guardian, she used the word flat for the dialogue for Eli, one of the brothers, and Charlie. And she was taken to task, I thought, quite effectively by one of the commentators on the Guardian site.
Yeah, she pissed somebody off. I saw that.
Well, the point that was made, that was a valid one, was that you are playing the straight man. You're not. You can just tell that these characters are thoughtful and deep rather than just flat and surface.
Yeah, I don't think she didn't seem to get the book, and that's okay. You can't win them all,
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't care very much for that review. I thought it was just very silly to me.
If we look then at the characters, it's a close look at Brotherhood, obviously, and I think it captures a relationship. I have a brother. You've got a brother?
I have an older and a younger, yeah. Especially being in the middle too, I've been the one who has been on the receiving end and then on the giving end of all sorts of tortures that we typically share with our siblings. And
yeah, it's not pleasant, is it? I mean, it can be pretty vicious.
Yeah, and especially these people, they've never been separated, so that only intensifies the rivalry. And then one being ambitious and one not, it's just set up for disaster, really, it seems to me.
One being perhaps more of a psychopath than the other.
One who relishes the work, and one who is sort of, wounded by it or revolted by it.
Questioning, or if not guilt, then a sort of a spiritual fatigue.
I would think so. Yeah. I mean, Eli's definitely exhausted. I think of him as a weary man.
Again, to draw on the Coen Brothers, and don't take this the wrong way, but
I like the Coen Brothers.
You look a bit like a character that should appear in a Coen Brothers film.
I hadn't thought of it. I don't know if that'll happen. I can't stand being in front of a camera, but the comparisons to the Coen Brothers doesn't bother me. I think that they're a talented couple of guys. And
again, the fact you're out from in Oregon and Fargo set out in South Dakota, there's just a lot of parallels or connections. I wonder too. Just getting back to the language, you talked about having fun with it. Did you say there's pleasure in getting a kind of a weird effect?
It's very much experimenting. You befriend these characters and you get to know them intimately, and then you experiment by putting them in situations where you know what will happen generally, but not perfectly until you get in there and you start sort of mapping everything out. And sometimes the effect or the result of whatever situation you've put these people into. My favorite parts are when something happens that is really unexpected and really sort of explosive, or suddenly you'll be writing a scene that you think will be very funny, and suddenly you'll take this really sorrowful turn, or
And it's as much of a revelation to you as it is to the reader, I guess.
No,
yeah.
sure. And
yeah.
sometimes things will happen. Oh, I can't believe that just happened. It's so interesting, you know.
Yeah.
And that's when I know I'm sort of on the right track, when I'm surprised by what's happening. If you go into something and you know what's going to happen, oftentimes you get what you think you'll get out of it, but very rarely do you get more. When you go in, you're not quite sure, and there's a sort of danger there, or there's a tension there. Oftentimes that'll turn into something far more interesting.
And I think I've read somewhere that you actually miss being in that space, right? Or are you back in it with something else now?
I have a book, about 100 pages of a new book, but I haven't been able to work on it since the Booker shortlist, basically.
Yeah.
It's been busy doing this kind of thing. And I do miss, you know, when you're working on something as large as a book, there's all sorts of tortures within that period of time that you're doing it, you know, self-doubt, and hating what you're doing, or worrying about it.
Slogging through
it, but it's really comforting. You just feel like that you're taken care of in a way, you know. And
doing something that has to be done.
Something that has to be done, but also it's such a big project. You know, it takes so long to do it.
And the risks are pretty high too.
Yeah, but it's to me it's a comfort. I mean, having like when I thought I was gonna have to stop, that was what was just such a drag for me. Was the idea that I really felt like I was doing what I should be doing, and to be taken away from that. You know, I felt so comforted once you finally get the characters in place and the story's taking shape and you're working towards the end goal. It just feels good,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
And every day feels meaningful. And you put in your hours every morning, and it just makes the rest of your life much more pleasant. You know, I feel good when I'm working on a big project like that. So I definitely miss that, and I'm looking forward to getting back into it. But I don't feel like I'm wasting my time taking time off. I think it's a good thing for the book, and it's nice to get out and meet all these bookish people, you know.
Yeah, and people who can give you different perspectives on what you've written, I guess. Have you had any sort of revelation thanks to other people's spins on your characters?
Yeah, there's been quite a few people have said things that are true, but things that I had not necessarily realized or recognized. And I was in Ireland doing an interview, and the first thing the interviewer said when she sat down was, she said, "So would you say that Tubb's the hero of the book?"
The horse.
Yeah, Tubb the horse is the hero of the book, which is something I would never have thought of. In its way, it's a true thing. I mean, or if it was for her, then it's true. That's the thing. I mean, everybody interprets the book in a different way. But I had never really viewed Tubb as a heroic figure until she brought that up, and since then I've sort of have thought of him as a heroic figure in the book. So.
Well, he stays in the book for one thing. He could have got cut loose pretty early on. Right?
Yeah. The relationship between Eli and Tubb was one of those parts that was an experiment. I felt like I was experimenting, and I think I like what the experiment turned up in terms of their friendship.
Yeah, kind of a loyalty and what a growth on the part of Eli.
I think so.
Sure.
Yeah. I think Eli recognizes himself in Tubb, and that's sort of where his sympathies. That's when his sympathies sort of amplify once he recognizes himself in his horse.
And Eli's a bit tubby too, isn't he?
Yeah. They're sort of the same being.
I wonder if we could get onto masturbation.
Yeah, let's do it.
This has to do with, again, I think one of those moments.
Yeah, that was one of them.
That was a moment and a half. And again, you think of the psychopathic character and you think, Jesus, what kind of mother could he have had to instruct him to masturbate, to relax?
Well, I think she was probably just a very intensely pragmatic woman. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else's sons. It's just one of those things that I think I was hoping to display how far Eli goes, how far Eli's rage transports him, because I had to make Eli a believable killer, and if it wasn't for the violent episodes, you would never necessarily believe that he would be capable of such a thing. So that scene begins with him kicking in the head of a man who's been dead for 10 seconds and just sort of demolishing this man's skull.
Yeah,
and then
flattening it.
And then stalking off and masturbating. So this seemed an effective way to let the reader know that Eli is not as gentle a man as maybe you had thought he was. But I keep waiting. It's funny. It doesn't come up more often. I'm sort of relieved to be talking about it. I think it's something that people skirt when they're discussing the book.
Well, it is a relief, of course.
But I remember that was one of the parts where I thought, well, I'm going to catch hell for this, because if there's one thing that John Wayne's not supposed to do is play with himself.
Speaking of compelling, that's a word that comes up in a lot of the reviews, and it comes up in lots of reviews, period.
Mm-hmm.
And picaresque. I wonder, can you just reflect on that feedback, and how'd you get there, and why do you think people are describing the book as such?
I don't know. I mean, I was just saying yesterday, I think that, my first book, critically it did well, but it just never really found a readership.
That's another nice thing, isn't it, too?
It
Your
was just
first book's going to get that readership now, I would think.
I would hope so, yeah. And I don't know if a lot of the people that read Sisters Brothers will like the first book because it's more dark, and I think it's hard to digest. It's a quite bleak book, but I don't think that one is necessarily better than the other. I think that I think of them both as, and I know some people think that the first is better than the second, but I think that they're sort of a piece. So it's sort of a mystery to me. I don't know why this one. I think that this one is obviously much more story based, and I think just generally speaking, it's more colorful. So I see why there's been a difference in terms of the numbers and why more people are reacting to this one. But it's not crystal clear to me. It's mysterious to me. I don't really know why this one is connecting and the others aren't. Perhaps it's just the familiarity of the backdrop. These are all things that I was worried that the familiarity of the backdrop would be a big strike against it. I didn't know what the reaction would be, and I'm surprised by the reaction. Not that because I don't think the book deserves it, but just because I'd grown accustomed to the idea that I was going to be one of those kinds of writers who maybe does fine critically, but numbers-wise doesn't never really breaks through. So that the book is pushing on and going into all these people's homes that I didn't have access to before. I puzzle over it, but I can't be anything but thankful about it.
I'm speaking to Patrick DeWitt, the author most recently of The Sisters Brothers. Speaking of background, there's a really good line that sticks with me about horses, and this has to do with Tubb. Mm-hmm. And the fact that he wanted to be able to name his own horse. He wanted a horse without history or habit. Mm-hmm. And I think you've just touched on that in a larger context as it might relate to your writing and the topic that you've chosen and the fact that the ground has already been trod. And can you expand on that a bit?
I had mixed feelings about going into... I remember when I realized that what I was doing was writing a Western novel, I was almost upset about it. I mean, it's just, why is this happening? How is this happening? But it's not as though you can just pick up and write about anything. You know, there has to be a drive behind it, and you have to be inspired throughout, or I do. And then if I'm not, then I know that I shouldn't be doing this thing. You know, so what started out as this bit of dialogue morphed into what became, you know, a novel in progress, and I just sort of resigned myself to it. I just think that there being familiar elements to this in terms of it being, you know, I believe it is part of a tradition, and you know, it's arguably a genre book. I knew that I would be able to make it my own in terms of eliminating everything. I didn't want to remind anyone of things we already know about Westerns. I didn't want it to be one of these books where you're told every fact that the author turns up at the library. I didn't want it to be a discussion of weapons and the pros and cons of obscure laws and all these things that you often find in the Western genre.
A little frontier mentality and
and I tried to cover new ground, and I think I partially succeeded in that.
So you wanted to name your horse?
Well, they want horses without names, or they're used to not naming horses. He got Tubb as part of a deal because his last horse had been killed, and so he was sort of given this second-hand horse. While his brother got to pick the other horse, who's a vastly superior horse, because Eli was in the hospital with a wounded leg. So that just sort of sets the stage for sibling rivalry and just Eli's sort of constant feeling that his brother's always gotten the upper hand on him. Yeah. And it was an efficient way to show people where we're at, you know, right away. So by page 2 or 3, you understand exactly what's going on.
The chapters are short.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of white space in the book.
Yeah.
It compares to watching these are scenes.
Yeah.
And you are involved in script writing. What do you make of that?
Well, I think again, that's one of those things I didn't really recognize. But pretty much every chapter is 3 to 7 pages, right around there. But it was pointed out to me in copy edits. It wasn't until the book had been sold in 3 different countries and I was going through edits with the publishers. Somebody said something complimentary, like, it's very wise that you chose to keep the chapter short. And up to that point, I had no idea that I'd done that. I do think that having read only a couple of Western books but seen a good many Western films, I wasn't doing it intentionally at the time. I wasn't referring to actual movies I'd seen, but my suspicion is that that's what I was sort of drawing on. I was drawing on the cinema rather than the literature. And so I think that accounts for it.
Well, you've got intermission in the book, too.
Yeah. I mean, that's the most overt thing. I mean, they do make, fast-paced little bursts of story. In terms of the white space, that was a demand on my part because my first book also had short chapters, but they ran them together, separated by a small white space. But I had wanted them to be a new page each one because it's the act of turning a page. I like the pause of that. So I just sort of asked nicely if they would do that for this book, and they were generous enough to go along with me.
I like the way too. The first line is in quite a bit larger type.
Yeah.
Is that your idea, or?
No, that was Echo Press did the layout with all the intermission titles and the black pages for the chapters, and they were very careful about it, and I think they did a very artful job. I like it a lot.
I'm trying to read in some sort of, does it or doesn't it have a look of like a saloon sign? The book itself came out in 3 countries around about the same time. Just because it got so much early hype, and the fact that it was nominated for the Booker makes it bloody difficult to get a first printing of the thing, which us collectors are fairly keen on doing. So I have, this is a 3rd printing, because it's got the Governor General's Literary Award and the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize on the very striking front cover. The
first edition in Annesley is really beautiful too. It's quite heavy and
it's a hardcover, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're talking right now in November of 2011. The book actually hit the stands at what point? Beginning of the year?
I think it might have been February. So
So
it's still quite new. Well, they went to with the French flaps. They did that one quite quickly.
Right.
So I think they ran through the first in hardcover and then they jumped to that format. And I think that there'll be a format without the French flaps shortly enough.
Just winding down, I think of Portland, Oregon, and I think of that funny, quirky TV show that came out that was based in Alaska. It was about a doctor that went up there. But anyway, I just wonder if breathing in that kind of atmosphere affected you in terms of choosing the genre.
I don't know. I would say no. I mean, I started the book actually in Washington State. I was living on an island called Bainbridge Island.
That's a beautiful part of the world.
It is. It's very pretty. I think it's just a whole number of things, and a lot of it was luck. We were talking about this. We just had lunch with the Canada Council, and we were discussing. I found a book in the Gold Rush for 25 cents at a yard sale. And when I was working on this, and when I got down to Portland, and it was still quite vague. The characters weren't quite in place yet, and I didn't know what year it was. I didn't know where they were. I didn't know what they were going to do. I was just sort of getting to know them as men. And then I found this book, and because of that book, I wrote a book that deals with the gold rush. And if I hadn't found that book that morning, if I'd passed by the garage sale, if I hadn't had a quarter on me or whatever it was, then this book wouldn't exist in this format. It would be some other kind of a book. So there was all these little sort of lucky happenings that sort of guided me throughout the writing of a book, and I think that that's probably quite normal. A lot of your discoveries are accidental discoveries. A lot of your
serendipitous
coincidences.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that happens, quite a few times in the writing of this book. And
I've heard that from others. Incidentally, it's just almost as if it was designed to be.
Yeah, but it's the kind of thing where you look back and you feel frightened almost, because if I hadn't gone out for a bike ride that day, or if I hadn't, all these things that lead to the end result, and so many of them just seem so perilous and tenuous, and
your life could have gone in a completely different direction.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that that's how it just is for most artists. The story of how I got an agent is like this horrific story that's involved luck so many times in so many different instances, and so you have to sort of have faith that you'll have some luck. And I think if you focus on something long enough, eventually you will turn up some luck.
Just finally, about your Canadianness and living in the States and winning a Canadian prize. Mm-hmm. Do you think of yourself as Canadian, or have you got one American parent, or how's that work?
I have a green card in the States. I'm still not a citizen there. I'm still a citizen here, and I have no plans to become a citizen there. I wouldn't rule it out, but I just don't see any reasoning for it now. But I've married an American. And I'm sired an American now, so I mean, I can't deny that I've spent many years in the States, and right now I consider Portland my home. But I wouldn't say that I consider myself an American. When people ask me if I'm traveling, where are you from, I always say I was born in Canada, but I live in the States. I guess it's a little bit complicated. I just brought my wife to Toronto. She'd never been to Canada, and I hope to show her around a little bit more. And we're certainly open to the idea of coming back, but it's not on the immediate horizon for us, I don't think. next year we're going to do a residency in Paris, and we're going to see if we can stay there for longer than the residency. But we're open to the idea. The whole thing that's nice about writing is they say you can do it anywhere if you do it. And so
well, especially if enough people know about the fact that you're doing it.
Yeah. Well, if you can eke out a living, and there's no real reason to stay in one place, then why would you? So we're going to take advantage of that a bit, and perhaps it'll bring us back to Canada, but I can't say for sure.
Well, I don't know if you have to feel apologetic about it.
But I will say that with all the awards season and everything, and just getting to come up to Toronto 3 times, and now here, and going to Calgary and Edmonton in a couple of weeks, it's been great for me getting to come here, and I feel much closer to the reading public, and getting to spend time with people at Anansi and Canada Council. I definitely do feel closer to Canadian writing heritage than I did beforehand.
Yeah, and I think there's a real pride too at how well you've done. Internationally, of course, that's often the case.
Yeah.
Canadians feel proud of their own for having done well abroad.
Yeah, no, it's been a very positive experience for me.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing some of it with us today.
Sure, happy to be here.
I've been speaking with Patrick DeWitt, who has just won the Governor General's Literary Fiction Award for his book, The Sisters, Brothers. Thanks again.